now move towards our first keynote speech of the conference. It is an honor to welcome Professor Dr. Hamish Coates for his speech. Professor Dr. Hamish Coates is an honorary professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He is also serving as a visiting professor at the Tsinghua University and executive dean at Holmes Institute, Australia.
Well, just assalamu alaikum. Just while the presentation is being loaded, thank you very much, former Chief Justice, distinguished leaders of the university, participants and conference organisers for the opportunity to speak. I must say it's a very hard act to follow. We hear a lot from people in my industry, and we call it an industry, about how we can make education better, but it's very rare that we not only have the opportunity to hear from someone who has clearly had a very senior role in global affairs, about how that can play out on the ground, but also to hear and see from students. We often talk about students, but quite often, quite often we don't actually hear from the students themselves. So I'm going to, I'm going to talk about a few things that I think we'll agree. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers, and I know that lawyers like a debate. So,
is that a good thing or what?
That's a great thing, because it's through discussion that we make the world better. And I also have a lot of friends.
Let me share the presentation to.
And I have a lot of friends who are teachers. And I also know that everyone here has been sitting down for about 2 hours. So while we get the technology working, can I invite everyone to stand up, please? Just stand up. Get the blood moving. If you need to, go like this. Thank you. This is wonderful. As a teacher, I can immediately tell who is just paying attention to their mobile phone and who is paying attention to me. And also, as someone who first came to Pakistan in 2006 as a teacher, I can tell. Thank you. I can relive 20 years down my teaching life track, the experiences that I learnt in Pakistan. I was taught as a teacher in Australia that if you want the students to be quiet, you go shh. And I thought I might have to do that after I asked you to stand up. But actually I learned in Pakistan, you get the duster and you go. And so I learnt my first piece of Pakistani teaching culture. And I learnt, of course, as we all do, that language is underpinned by culture. If I can talk in the language of IT, language is just part of culture, and culture is the operating system. Yeah? Culture is the operating system. So to my learned colleagues' remarks about language, I fully agree, and I would give some response before I resume my presentation, fully in the language of an outsider here. The first is that I'm speaking Australian, not English, you may tell. There are many, many, many differences, and we don't have time for those today, but after the presentation, if you would like to learn some more Australian, please make contact with me. The second is, at the age of 45, I went and worked without any training whatsoever in the top university in China, where I worked for 6 years and realised, sitting through all sorts of meetings and presentations, not like in Pakistan, in full Chinese Mandarin, that in fact I could immerse myself in that culture, learn the culture, and that in fact understanding people was the most important part of language. The third thing, and here I get a little bit legal, is, in fact, in Australia, I checked this, because in Australia we have the situation that we have a Chinese teacher teaching 300-400 Chinese students. And I checked, because my main field of expertise is higher education governance. And I'll come back to the piece about higher education later. I checked, and in fact it is completely legal to teach in whatever language you want to whichever students you want. So it is in fact completely feasible to teach in the language of Mandarin Chinese in Australia. And in fact you can easily do that. And in fact at a school in Victoria, my own daughter learns mathematics and Chinese because she wants to practice that, and her teacher happens to be Chinese by background. So that goes to my final point about language and what my main role was working at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And that is, I think the world is very, very complicated, rich, and made much better by a plurality of language. But still we find that the global language of business, politics, science, diplomacy is English. How long that will last, I do not know. It is changing often, and of course within our home of Asia, it will probably change more quickly than it will in the whole world. But if we do want to teach our students to be global players, the first point I will make in my presentation, we do also have to teach them to be at least passable communicators in English. And that will free them to participate and argue their brilliance on the great stage of the world. So with that, I have really enjoyed the initial presentation. Thank you so much. It's such a treat to actually have some life underneath our research. You know, I have been doing education research for 25 years. I've led some very large projects for all of the world's biggest governments, big universities. With regret, I would say, and I speak as a statistician, that the amount of difference that I've made is less than 0.01%. The translation from research to practice is always too slow, too mixed up, too corrupted, and too involved with all of the interests that wrap around education. So people that spend our lives trying to make education better, we unfortunately don't have the same experience as people who make iPhones. They make an improvement, the iPhone improves. We make an improvement, sometimes after 20 years, we see an outcome. It's not as bad as all of that. Sometimes we do see some success, but increasingly, I've come to believe that for research to make a difference, we have to involve also advocacy. Research published amongst researchers is not meaningless, but it's much more meaningless than it was 20 years ago. And the reason for that is there are so many more research papers, researchers, journals in the whole world. And for that, I edit 2 journals, one for the British and one for the Chinese. And every time we publish a paper, we promote it through social and public commercial media so that the public and the educators of the world can hear our research. And it's for that reason that we founded the Higher Education Futures Lab recently to try and create more public dialogue. There is no point in researchers talking to researchers alone. That is a waste of great brains. To train a researcher takes 20, 30 years, and yet people that shape education, as our learned colleague said, often have no formal training in the field. So it's our job to take our lessons from this conference and go out and use them to advocate. And it is so charming and so honouring to be a teacher and see your students grow up and make a difference in the world. But also we must do that through our research. I'm going to talk fearlessly about higher education, which I will deconstruct at the end of my talk. But I am going to talk about higher education. That's my field. I've worked in school education, most recently in early childhood education, which I actually think is the most important part of education. We can teach so many things to students, if we call them that, and maybe we should, under the age of 5, that we can't teach a 40. My 5-year-old daughter learnt Mandarin Chinese native fluency in 3 years from the age of 5. I still struggle. So that tells us so much. In higher education, we have seen so many different periods in the last few decades. In fact, in the last 100 years, and we start with this idea of colonial higher education, which us countries which started as colonies, and many did, have still experienced to this day. But we have moved through collegial education. That's why I'm here now as a colleague, a long-term colleague of the Vice-Chancellor, good academic research colleague, to have conversations about open, increasingly commercial and connected higher education. But increasingly, as we have seen in the last 5-6 years, but even in the last few months, education has become incredibly competitive. Education is not just about educating students, it's about creating capabilities that can be used in geopolitical battles, in industrial affairs, and increasingly in commercial wealth building. It's not just about students, and we have to be mindful of those interests that shape students. They do start as innocents, but they end up as incredibly valuable PhDs like us, many of us. We've seen higher education change massively in the last 5-6 years to a situation where humans were shipped around the planet on planes to where we have to use, or we can use, digital technologies to do much of what we used to do. We call that T&E 4.0, Transnational Education 4.0. And in fact, a student can now conduct a degree, including at this university, by never leaving their home country. That's an amazing transformation when you think about it, something that wasn't feasible 10 years ago. So as a researcher, we created a framework to try and understand this. You must understand that Tsinghua University has aspirations to be one of the world's most important global universities, so it deeply studies what the trends and developments are in global higher education. We can't just rely on rankings. We can't rely on students' money. We have to think deeply about what it involves. And then we applied that to study the different eras of higher education. I'm not going to read through all these PowerPoints, you'll be pleased, but you can see by the different analyses that the nature of higher education has deeply changed. And I think we need to deeply change it even further. This framework has merely given us a canvas, if you like, to understand the contemporary dynamics, which I'll sketch through quickly. In fact, we published these, and this is the beauty of research, we published these in a paper in 2020 at the start of the global pandemic that we've just shared and we're just out of. And we've seen here that some of the developments that happened in that pandemic still reside with us today. They have fundamentally changed how we go about doing higher education, understanding higher education, and as I will close with, thinking about what higher education is. I'm not going to read through all of these. I know even though we got the blood moving, time is upon us and everyone wants to go to morning tea. You can certainly read the paper afterwards. I urge you to read the paper, and if you can't read it because it's behind a paywall from one of the world's top 4 scientific publishers, either email me or rest assured that we will blog it soon. It will be available to all. And to the credit of those publishers, they're now happy for us to do that. That is indeed a change. What is clear is that education has become more nationalised. It's become far more local. I participated in a conference here virtually 6 months ago. I couldn't attend because of the airfare arrangements and times. But isn't it much more wonderful to be in a room together? That's what makes education great. I did my PhD on online learning in 2001. I still don't like doing it, really, but it helps us communicate. But if we can be together, if we can share our ideas as humans, life is much richer. The other thing that's happening, and I'll return to this in my closing remarks, is education is becoming much more regionalised. We used to talk about global student competencies, global rankings, global teachers, global faculty, global research. Increasingly, I think we will find that we're going to talk about regions of higher education. And that is really, really important for absolutely everyone in this room, because within about 5 or 6 hours flight of Singapore, you are within about 5 of 8 billion humans and the world's most impressive, most future-centric higher education system. That, and this is the good part for people like me, we know very, very little about. We don't actually even know how many universities there are in Asia. True. We've just discovered how many there are in Europe, and there's some agreement on that. We've known for some time how many there are in North America. But in Asia, and I take Asia very broadly, my definition of Asia goes from the bottom of Australia to the top of the world, through to, say, Hawaii, all the way over to Turkey. That's my definition of Asia. Well, we can't even define Asia. There's no solid definition of Asia, but that's mine. That's the world's biggest higher education zone, and you're in the middle of it. So you are the future of higher education, which like I said before, thanks to my colleague, I will come back to at the end. Education has changed, and I've been delighted to learn that the transformations have been made here to ensure that people can engage using digital technologies and learn higher education on their phone. Once upon a time, being 10 years ago, I would have thought that was really bad, that students should be in a room with a teacher. But increasingly as well, if they can be in a room with a teacher and use their phone so that they can have the opportunity to access learning and success, that's amazing. And that's not going away. But it does have all sorts of implications for universities. It means that universities are now post-institutional players. Coursera, which started as one of the world's most famous MOOCs, which was going to change higher education forever in 2012, is now selling courseware. So it's competing against you here. So is edX, which got sold to a commercial firm, which went into insolvency, and is now coming back as a source of courseware, which will compete with you here. So it's a global world, and a world that we have to be more mindful of the value we add within. It's also increasingly commercial, and we just published a paper for the British journal that I edit yesterday on how for-profit global or transnational higher education is the future of higher education. Holmes Institute is part of the Holmes Education Group that I work at in Melbourne. It is a private for-profit institution. So I have a deep sense of what that means to operate in a for-profit higher education environment. It was new to me when I started working there just a few years ago, but it is certainly not new to the world, and it is increasingly a part of the world. For example, we learnt from a student that I had at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University 5 years ago that 30% of the education at UC Berkeley, your alma mater, 30%. And the student found this by freedom of information to someone who'd collected these secret contracts as part of a law PhD at Harvard. 30% is done by for-profit private firms at UC Berkeley, really? Which is the most flat, anarchical research institution, I know the ex-president well, that you could imagine. But there's a lot of private activity in higher education. And of course, that means the campus that we know and love takes a different form. We're told by the tech firms that the campus is no longer as relevant as it was, but in fact, it's made the campus much more valuable. It brings people together. And I don't just mean campuses like this, but learning hubs all around the world. And of course, there are implications for research. Now, research in my field of education may take some time to hit practice, but increasingly, research in universities is being seen by governments as a huge investment which is critically important for their national future or the industry's future. So we need to think carefully about how researchers collaborate, and we have colleagues that have just had a conference in Oxford on this. Particularly, of course, we need to look at the world's two great research partners, China and America, and how they collaborate, and how that's going to change in coming years and what that means for the world, quite literally. The research needs to be made much more valuable across the board. The people of the country need to see the value of the public investment, which is huge. Huge investment, but they often don't see huge value. Universities have often reached for the stars, and as they have done so, their feet have lifted away from the ground. And that must be changed. Because what we see now happening in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in the Netherlands, is that the governments have now seen higher education not as a facilitator for growing their economy and social good, but as something that gets in the way and is a waste of money. We have to change that. Because I think all of us, apart from kindergartens and schools, would see universities as basically pretty good things. But obviously not all do. So we need to communicate the message better. And I have to say, I don't think global rankings are the future for us in that area. We have to tell a much broader story, and I'll come back to that later. And of course, education is fundamentally about humans, and what we see happening is increasingly diverse ways that humans engage in higher education. Education has an impact on people in different ways. A lot of Asian countries in East Asia have produced huge volumes of engineers. But as their economy and society changes, they now see that they need artists, as we heard from the student just before. Because to create the things that engineers build, you've got to think in new and different ways. And engineering education doesn't always teach you how to do that. Of course, faculty are changing. Most faculty in the world in future will come from Asia. So that's really quite a huge change. It takes pretty much 30 years from birth to produce someone who can teach in a university, and the litmus test to that is supervise a PhD student. So if you think now, where do we look 30 years down the track? Who is producing the world's greatest number of PhDs? It is in our region. Okay? So increasingly in 2050, in 2060, the faculty of the world will look exactly like Asia. That is not who you learnt off at UC Berkeley. That is not who I learnt off. But increasingly that's going to be the case. And that's huge in terms of the connections, the ways of thinking, the linguistic communities that those people are part of, and of course the global flows of Asia. So, just taking stock very briefly, we have now, I think, seen the end of, or we're soon seeing the end of what I referred to as the commercial era of higher. It's where we trade humans to make money to pay for research so we can show ourselves to be good in global rankings. That's the business model. It's a simple, for those of you who are statisticians and the students, it's a very simple mathematical equation. And it's kind of boring. It leaves a lot out. Almost everything that you talked about this morning is left out. But countries have played that game, but the game, to a certain extent, is now changing. Increasingly, we're in a competitive, globalised world, an increasingly regionalised world, where governments are controlling increasingly digitalised, commoditised education services. And that's necessary, right? We have so many people participating in higher education, and it was never set up to educate so many people. We have a model of a professor with a small number of students teaching under a tree, but now teaching thousands and thousands of students at the world's top universities. It's all happened in 10 years, and now we're adjusting to those changes. So where do I think, with colleagues, and I can share the research underneath all of this if you want to see it, where do I think the innovation frontiers are going? If we focus on quality, we look at how things are good or bad. Efficiency is faster or cheaper, right? But productivity is a mix of both. How do we actually get that step change, to use the language of economists, step change productivity, which is the language of government, oftentimes, which is the language that resonates with the people who pay for universities? How do we get that change happening? I'm going to go through a few things. that I think are the keys to actually helping us understand and make the future. And the first is, of course, this thing called AI, okay, which we've been dealing with since 1965. I studied AI at the University of Melbourne in 1991. I have seen in the 25 years I've been in education, research and leadership roles, every year the tech firms saying they're going to solve the problem of education, and every year the problems of education for anything get worse. We need to invest in solving education, not in buying tech, but tech's very, very big, okay? But hopefully we can start to see that it's humans in integrity that matter. And what we've seen with AI in particular is that the amount of global organised crime involved in higher education has gone through the roof. It's not only gone through the roof, it's gone into the hearts of our students. This is the definition of contract cheating from my own country, Australia's tertiary regulator, TEXA. Definition of academic integrity, contract cheating being one manifestation of that. Okay? And we increasingly see that students are using artificial intelligence to just bypass their own brains. And in fact, it gets a little bit crazy because we pay staff to teach them and then mark work which has been produced by a machine. Why don't we just have robots as the staff in the first place? And in fact, we can. We are all replaceable. You could take this video of my face and I could read any course in the world, even astrophysics, which I know almost nothing about except I like stars. So I asked my 10-year-old child, because children always give you a good, clean, quick answer, and she said she wouldn't bother going to university if she was taught by an avatar. She wants to be taught by humans. So I thought, wow, one, we've got a job for a little bit longer, and two, isn't that wonderful? But three, we do have a huge problem. We have a problem not with students using AI. That's understandable. We all use the technologies that we can. We have a problem with universities having the capacity to govern that use in ways that show that students are acting according to academic integrity. Okay? We don't want to graduate students who are cheaters, liars, thieves, even if they don't know that's what they're doing. So we must train them. And to do that, we need to be aware that this is happening. We need to raise it to the highest levels of the university. I have spent my career developing statistics and indicators for governments, but we don't have statistics and indicators for governments on this very matter. So we have created them. I gave my presentation some months ago here on this matter, so I won't go into this in detail. But we do now have a way of determining if a university is helping their students work better with technology, not replace their own self with that technology, which of course is not in anyone's interest whatsoever. And of course we need to make some reforms. Any university that basically isn't doing these 8 things is kidding themselves and not producing students with integrity, graduates with integrity. We have to do these things. Otherwise, the students are basically bypassing their brain using this thing. And I'm not here to teach computers how to think. Of course, the next part is we have to take education seriously. Now, this is a wonderful university to have this conversation, but it's a very difficult conversation because in most universities, faculty are hired to do research, not to teach. We all know that. In fact, as I was telling Dr. Nasir recently, I just tried to have myself accredited as a teacher in the state of Victoria, where I've taught at University of Melbourne for 20 years, and I was rejected. And it proved to me that academics and universities aren't qualified teachers. So I printed that email and put it on my office wall. And I think, well, if that's the case, what does it take to have professional teachers in universities? Which in fact is the truth. Most people who work in higher education teach. They don't do research. And the ones, we're being videoed, but I'll say this very quietly, the ones that often do research, we don't want them to teach. Yeah, so there's 2 types. But we must make sure that those who teach have basic professional competencies, like accountants, like lawyers, like engineers. And we have to make sure that they are qualified to do their job. But we also have to reform the education process. We have to make sure that assessment is done in ways that don't punish students, but enable students. And I'll say some more about that. Assessment is my background, and it is the worst part of almost every form of education. Curriculum has been changed. Even though we're not professional teachers in higher education, we have experience and we ourselves get better. But assessment, we often do the same way we did it 100 years ago. So we have to improve that. We need to sweat the curriculum. What do I mean by that? Well, it became clear to me working in a public university and a private institution that if you only teach one, if I only give this PowerPoint once per year, that's a waste of public money. The students want to access it all the time. So how do we help the students access that? And I'll come back to that. And of course, we have to provide experiences that are authentic for students. People want to experience education with real humans. They want to have education that makes them think, makes their lives richer. And of course, increasingly, we need to have education that supports students, because students these days in higher education come from every walk and background. Teachers have to help students succeed. Professional teachers' job is not to teach the curriculum. Professional teachers' job is to help every student succeed. I would like to do that right here as the honorary teacher standing at the lectern and ask everyone to please, you'll see I think the email's on the last slide, send an email saying at least 1 or 2 or 3 things that you've picked up from our morning session. Yeah, I really think that if you invest 2 or 3 hours sitting in these comfortable chairs, you need to have picked up at least 2 or 3 things. That's called the 1-minute paper that my friend Tom Angelo invented at Harvard during his PhD some decades ago. And it would be amazing if I then share that with everyone. You will see that we have 200 or 300 times 3, so 600 completely different learnings from this talk. And that tells us as teachers that actually every single person learns in different ways. And for that, we need to come to the big elephant in the room for me, and that is assessment. We need to reform the way we measure students' learning. Often as teachers, we think, I have provided 100 things, and I'll give you a test or an exam, and then I'll grade how many of those 100 things. I call this the flip-top head. We open up the head, pour the knowledge inside, close the head, and see how much is still in there. And with regret, it's often dispiriting for a teacher to see that the student only gets 30%, which doesn't mean the student failed, it means that the teacher failed to impart 70%. We used to call that mastery learning, but actually what that represents is the failure. I love these words: rotten, oppressive, tyranny. These words are exactly what I'm talking about. If I teach a student all year and the student fails, that's actually on me as much as it's on the student. It may be me and my colleagues, but it's not just the student. So we need to think about how we measure students' learning in ways that enhance their success. We have done that. Technology has been our friend. When you print things out and distribute it, it has to be the same for everyone, more or less. But when I use technology, I can give everyone a different learning experience. And we have done that. But more importantly, in doing that, we have realised that we can actually redo the whole deal. And here's where I start to come into my major criticism of higher education. Because universities, by and large, assume that everyone wants the same pizza. And the pizza is one with the lot. It's got everything on it. But some students just want a single nut or a single apple. But we still sell them the pizza, and we often charge them for the box as well. And that's a waste of their time. It's actually a waste of the university's time. And it's a waste of the society's time, and often the workers, the boss's time, if they're already working. So we need to increasingly think that what we're doing as universities, as schools, as kindergartens, as the other things which I'll turn to, we don't yet have names for, we need to think that what we're doing is enabling learning, not selling education. And that comes from the idea of the circular economy. We are enabling learning, not selling education. If we sell education, we failed already. Our heart is not in the right place. If we're enabling learning, we're helping people become better humans and succeed, not just for themselves, but for their communities. And in fact, once we do this, we can flip the whole education deal. And there are some studies that have looked at doing this. And I think the biggest part, or one of the huge parts that the former Chief Justice identified as being a failure in the education system is something that Bill Gates identified and funded a project to analyse 20 years ago in the US. And that is the idea of a grade. Because we know that some students, and we saw it here today, some students who are 12 and 15, the 15-year-old might struggle for what the 12-year-old already gets. But we force that 12-year-old through 3 years of boredom. And that 15-year-old is facing the pressure of failure. We don't have to do that. We don't have to do that anymore. But first of all, we have to understand when the student comes into our home, our institution, who is that student? What's already in their body, in their soul, in their mind? And then we can tailor our education for them. And if we do this, we can then work with communities to redesign education, support students, and help them succeed. And we have pilots underway right now in Australia to try and look at how we can do this. Because particularly if someone has already left school and left university, it is a real waste of time and money to force people to go back and relearn stuff they already know. I told you I was rejected from becoming a K-12 registered school teacher in my home state of Victoria just 1 or 2 weeks ago, after 25 years of teaching, designing education. Oh, it's fine. I accept that. Accreditors have their role. I work with them. I love them. If we didn't have accreditation, we wouldn't have education. But the answer for me is not to go back and do 3 years of study. The answer is to assess what I have and just top it up a little bit. Enable me to be a teacher as quickly as possible. Because in Australia, we have a workforce shortage of 50,000 school teachers. 50,000. We can't wait. I don't want to teach next year, but I want to teach maybe in 10 years. We can't wait for me to go and do 3 years of study. And increasingly, once we've started to think about the individual's value, we can then look at how we, like I said before, start to sell or promote or cultivate or educate the community into the value that we serve. And for that, we need to step outside our own communities. Step outside where we have worked for 10 or 20 years and work in different communities. Go and stand in a village. Go and work in a company. Go and work in government. Go and work in a foreign country. Do something. Take a different job altogether. Go and build a road. Do something in the community and see how they see our work here in universities. And even after a week, it will change your thinking. What we need to do is show that education adds value, not that education is a cost. And we're not going to do that by selling the service that we have now to people who we think want to buy it. We're going to do that by stepping outside the communities we currently have and building broader notions of value. And the project that initially took me to go and work in China was the Double First Class Initiative, which is a replacement of the world-class university rankings, which were invented by my colleagues in Shanghai. And that was in 2016. So the Chinese university system, which by accounts is now the world's largest, has moved already to have this way of thinking. We have then started thinking, well, how can we take that globally? And the we there is my colleagues all around the world that see that the way we currently talk about universities and education is not only yielding diminishing returns, it's harmful for what we're trying to achieve. It's not helping us, it's not helping our communities. And we have to find these sorts of indicators, which we are also now piloting to see how we can work. Now, how does all this scale? How do we take these ideas? Because good ideas without a way to implement them are wasted ideas. Recently, I got approached by Professor Lily Kong, who's the president of Singapore Management University, to think about how we can educate people for the 100 years they are going to live. And this is where I start to criticise higher education, because if we're going to live for 100 years, we need to have more than 16, 17 years of schooling and 3 or 4 years of tertiary education. Like I said, I need to go back and learn how to become a school teacher. We all need to learn. And if you ask yourself, when was the last time not you taught, but you actually learned something, that tells you a lot about where you think you're going with your career. It has to be ongoing at all levels. Okay? So what they've actually done, and Singapore is actually the world leader in this area, they've started to invent programs to teach people from the ages of, say, 25 to 65. And here's the first formal part of that program at the National University of Singapore, which is an amazing institution. And they've then got something called the Distinguished Senior Fellowship Program, where you go back at the age of 45 to 55, change what you do, and end up running a school instead of being Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. That's a huge transformation for higher education to make. In my country, and most countries I'm familiar with, universities cannot do this. They actually financially and by accreditation penalised, if you like, from offering lifelong learning. And yet when you think about it, if you're going to be relevant to the community, there's many more people from 25 to 80 than there is from 0 to 25. And those people often have very huge needs for education, reskilling and upskilling, even transformational professional things. I could study mechanical engineering and start work as a mechanical engineer in 3 years' time. Why not? Well, we get caught in this rut that a career is 40 years, but it's not anymore because we're going to live to we're 100, or at least in Singapore. So with that in mind, we need to start thinking about not just higher education being a little few years in the 20s typically, but something that's distributed all across the lifespan. And that is, we think, and the we being UNESCO, Korea, certain big universities in the US, Stanford, Georgia Tech, Singapore, and increasingly across the major cities of mainland China, we think that is absolutely imperative for universities to engage and reskill and upskill the populations that they are paid to serve. So just by way of summary, I've talked about some of the past, where we are now and some of the futures. But of course, education keeps throwing interesting things at us. And I've mentioned a few of these upcoming issues. It's where I spend my life with my colleagues, trying to think 5 to 7 to 15 years down the track, not 1 week or 2 months. And like I said, we now have some data. I believe this is actually some of the first comparative data on higher education that we've ever compiled. You'll see I have a question mark against the 7,000 Asian universities. Actually, we have no idea. If anyone knows, tell us. We've consulted national databases, World Bank, UNESCO, all the usual things. And I have to say, if you actually looked at those usual statistical sources, you would never come to Asia. You would think it's a polluted, terrible place to live your life. But actually, if you're people like us, you would think it's the most amazing, innovative, dynamic place in the world. So we have to create new statistics that actually suit Asia, not statistics that were developed 80 years ago. And increasingly, I hope you can join this conversation. I hope you can think about how we can create research that impacts policy and practice. It doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in jumps. It happens in transformational moment, not gradual reform. I hope you can think about what universities will look like in 10 years when populations in the 18 to 23, particularly in East Asia, but in many, many countries are going down. Japan is feeling this now. China increase. In 10 years' time, China will. Okay. What will higher education be there to serve? And what are the futures of higher education that you can contribute to? Be it in early childhood, vocational, secondary, primary, higher, lifelong. Education is a life-wide thing. So how can you make a contribution, and what differences can you make? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Hamish Coates, for sharing your expertise and valuable insights. Now, I would request the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Allama Iqbal Open University, Professor Dr. Nasir Mahmood, for the vote of thanks. Professor Dr. Nasir Mahmood is also the Conference Chair of ICRPE 2025.
Hamish, with a prior apology, I know even if I speak in Urdu, you will understand me. Because we know each other for long. We know what we'll talk about. So, विजय जी बहुत ये 8वीं शायद हमारी conference है. But the way I am pleased today about the conference, I've never been before. आज के दिन अगर आप देखिए तो आपके पास बहुत सारे ऐसे लोग इस कॉन्फ्रेंस में हैं इस दफ़ा जो अपना जहन सोच रखते हैं और सिर्फ जहन और सोच नहीं रखते हैं, उनके अमल उनकी सोच के अक्कास हैं. सो इस दफ़ा हमने फोकस बुनियादी तौर पे इस चीज़ पे रखा कि प्योर एकेडमिक्स नहीं, जो रिसर्च करते हैं, पेपर छापते हैं और वो पेपर फिर किसी न किसी दराज में चले जाते हैं और कोई सुनता नहीं, पढ़ता नहीं, बल्कि मैं अपने लिखे हुए पेपर ख़ुद भी नहीं पढ़ता उसके बाद जब वो एक दफ़ा छप जाते हैं. तो उन लोगों को भी उनसे सीखा जाए जिन्होंने ज़िंदगी इन चीज़ों को करके गुजारी है, और बच्चों की वॉइस जो जिनके लिए ये सारा कुछ किया जाता है, उनकी आवाज़ हम कभी नहीं सुनते, बहुत रेयरली हम सुनते हैं जी. पिछले साल आपको याद हो तो हमने अमजद साकिब साहब को रहमत दी थी. उनका अपना एक तालीम में जो खिदमत है उसका एक मॉडल है अपना, और जो उन्होंने अपनी किताब अख़ुवत में भी लिखा हुआ है. सो जो सफ़र है उनका, वो भी एक अपनी तरह का मॉडल है, ये भी एक अपनी तरह का मॉडल है. और आप मकसद इसका सिर्फ एक है जी, हम जो एकेडमिक्स से इकट्ठे हुए लोग हैं, यूनिवर्सिटियों के माहौल में रहते हैं, रिसर्चेस करते हैं, पेपर छापते रहते हैं बहुत सारे. मैं चाहता हूँ कि तब्दीली जो है अब इस तरह मुमकिन है कि आपके जहनों को बदल दिया जाए. आप जो इस फील्ड में रहना है, जिन्होंने यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में, आपका सोचने का अंदाज़ जो है वो तब्दील किया जाए कि हमारे मसाइल वो नहीं हैं शायद सारे जिनको हम मसाइल समझ के एजुकेशन ठीक करने चले हैं. हमारे मसाइल की नौइयत और है जो एट टाइम्स हम शायद न सोचते हैं ना एड्रेस करते हैं जी. सो ये जितनी भी हमारी फैकल्टी हमारी यूनिवर्सिटी से, दूसरी तमाम यूनिवर्सिटी से तशरीफ़ रखते हैं, आपके ज़रिए आपके स्टूडेंट्स, और फिर आगे हम चाहते हैं कि ये तब्दील कर दिया जाए. जो मुआशरा जिस जगह पहुंच गया हुआ है ना, इसकी समझ नहीं आती कि इसको कहाँ से पकड़ा जाए तो ये ख़राबी दूर होने का साइकिल शुरू किया जा सकता है. क्योंकि हर चीज़ ही अपने लोएस्ट एब पे पहुंच गई. किसी चीज़ को भी हाथ लगाएं तो अपनी उस हालत को पहुंची हुई है कि जहाँ पे गलत इतनी ज़्यादा तादाद और मिकदार में है कि वो सारा गलत आपको सोचने पे ठीक लगने लगता है, और जो ठीक कह रहा होता है वो आपको गलत लगने लगता है. सो इस तब्दीली के लिए जी मैं बहुत मशकूर हूँ आपका. हैमिश हैज़ ऑलवेज़ बिन वेरी काइंड टू मी जी. वी मेट फर्स्ट टाइम इन 2006 and he was as impressive in 2006 as is today. He has always had something to offer to all of us which is new. He has got his own point of view on things, and which is all based on his learning and practice. And now it's almost 25 years since then. So thank you very much for coming here, Hamish. We had your session online, another conference, but online does not make that impact as when you're standing here in front of people. तमाम फैकल्टी जो यहाँ मौजूद है जी, वो और तमाम साथीदार स्टूडेंट تمام کولیگس ہمارے جو یہاں تشریف رکھتے ہیں مختلف شعبہ جات سے، آپ سب کے لیے آئی ہوپ کہ یہ 2 دن جو ہیں آپ اس میں سے وہی بات جو ابھی ہیمش کہہ رہا تھا، کوئی 2-3 پوائنٹس ایسے نوٹ کریے جو زندگی کو کے سوچنے کے انداز کو تبدیل کر سکتے ہیں، جی پرابلمس کو دیکھنے کے طریقے کو بدل سکتے ہیں. ڈاکٹر انجم لائی یہاں پہ تشریف رکھتی ہیں جی، اور بہت سارے نام ہیں. عرفان مظفر صاحب بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں. آپ ہر روز سیشن میں ایک پینل ڈسکشن ہے جی، اور اس پینل ڈسکشن کو آپ نے اس براڈر تھیم کے کانٹیکسٹ میں دیکھنا ہے جو ہم نے اس دفعہ سیٹ کیا ہے، وچ از ری ویمپنگ فار دا فیوچر، ری ویمپنگ آف ایجوکیشن فار دا فیوچر. اور کسی کا باہر سے انتظار نہیں کر سکتے کہ کوئی آئے گا فلاں چیز ٹھیک ہوگی تو میں اس کو ٹھیک کروں گا. آپ اپنا حصہ ہم ٹھیک کرنا شروع کر دیں، باقی لوگ اپنے کام کرتے رہیں گے جب انہوں نے کرنے ہیں جی. اور ڈاکٹر ابھی جج صاحب فرما رہے تھے اور میں ایگری کرتا ہوں اس بات سے جی کہ تعلیم سب سے بنیادی چیز ہے میرے نزدیک جس کے ذریعے سے تبدیل کیا جا سکتا ہے. یہ لمبا راستہ ہے، جس شارٹ کٹ اور جس طرح کی سوچ سے ہم کرتے ہیں تعلیمی ایمرجنسی، وہ ایمرجنسی نہیں لگتی جی. 4تھی ایمرجنسی لگائی ہے ہم نے اس گورنمنٹ نے، اور ہر ایمرجنسی کے بعد تعلیم پہلے سے زیادہ بری حالت میں ہوتی ہے. سو وہ ایمرجنسی پتہ نہیں تعلیم کی صحت کے متعلق ہوتی ہے یا تعلیم کے بڑھانے کے متعلق ہوتی ہے. سو ان جو مووز ہیں ان کو چھوڑیے، ہم اپنا کام شروع کریں. اس کراس روڈ پہ مجھے لگتا ہے دیکھیے کہ ہمیں یہی واضح نہیں ہے کہ ہم تعلیم سے حاصل کیا کرنا چاہتے ہیں. تعلیم بچوں کو پڑھانا ہے کنڈر گارڈن سے سٹارٹ کر کے، جب یہ پڑھ کے نکلے تو میں چاہتا کیا ہوں کہ یہ کیسا ہو. مجھے آج تک یہ فیصلہ نہیں کر سکا کبھی میں اسی بحث میں پڑا رہتا ہوں کہ تعلیم اردو میں ہوگی کہ انگریزی میں ہوگی، تعلیم جو ہے وہ کتنے مضامین پہ مشتمل ہوگی، بستہ کس سائز کا ہوگا، اساتذہ کس طرح کے ہوں گے، کہاں کتنی طرح کی کوالیفیکیشن رکھتے ہوں گے، ان کی مانیٹرنگ کے لیے سسٹم کیسا بنایا جائے گا، نصاب یہاں کا اچھا ہوتا ہے یا سنگاپور کا اچھا ہوتا ہے. میری ساری زندگی اسی بحث میں اور ان تمام irrelevant چیزوں میں گزر گئی ہے اب تک. یہ نہیں کہ یہ تمام چیزیں بے معنی ہیں، لیکن یہ مین فوکس تعلیم کا نہیں ہے. ہمیں اس وقت جو ہے جی اپنے پرابلمس کو جو کہ ہم سب کو پتہ ہے اس کو کہیں سے ڈھونڈنے کی ضرورت نہیں ہے. ہر آدمی جانتا ہے کہ جو میں پڑھاتا ہوں وہ irrelevant ہے، does not add any value to the life of people. جس فارم میں میں کر رہا ہوں، ہم میں سے سب کو پتہ ہے کہ ہمارے کو 28 ملین 28 ملین بچے اسکول نہیں آتے. ہم ہر دفعہ اس کو ہی ڈھونڈنا شروع کر دیتے ہیں کہ کتنے نہیں آتے، جبکہ سب کو پتہ ہے کتنے بچے اسکول نہیں آتے. ہم اس کو ایڈریس نہیں کر سکے. جو آ جاتے ہیں بچے بچائے، اور یہ 28 ملین جی کو 43% سے زیادہ ہے، یعنی جتنے بچوں کو اپنی اس عمر میں اسکول جانا چاہیے ان کا تقریباً آدھا حصہ اسکول تک جاتا ہی نہیں ہے. تقریباً آدھا حصہ جی 43% ہے یہ. اچھا، اس کے بعد جو چلے جاتے ہیں ان کے ساتھ ہم کیا کرتے ہیں؟ جو اسکول آ جاتا ہے، اسکول پوری طرح سے ڈیزائنڈ ہیں کہ کسی کو اسکول میں رکھنا نہیں. ہم نے یہ اس طرح سے متنفر ہو جائیں اس عمل سے کہ یہ ادھر خود چھوڑ جائیں، یا یہ ہے کہ ان کا کوئی مجبوری ان کو اسکول سے ہٹا لے. پوری ہمارے اسکول میں انالوجی بناتا ہوتا ہوں جی کہ ہمارے اسکول اور جیل اپنی صفات میں مور اور لیس ایک ہی جیسے ہیں. اگر آپ کبھی کسی بچے کی آنکھ سے دیکھیں کہ آپ کے گورنمنٹ اسکولوں میں اور ان میں بہت انالوجی پائی جاتی ہے. کیپٹیو ہیں دونوں جگہ پہ لوگ، دونوں جگہ پہ لوگوں کو ایک پری ڈیسائیڈڈ اسکیجول مینیو دیا جاتا ہے جس مینیو پہ انہوں نے چلنا ہے. جیل میں بھی ویسے ہی ہوتا ہے، اسکول میں بھی ویسے ہی ہوتا ہے. وہاں پہ بھی آپ کو ہر روز سزا کا ڈر ہوتا ہے، یہاں پہ بھی آپ کو ہر روز سزا کا ڈر ہوتا ہے. وہاں پہ بھی آپ کو پتہ ہوتا ہے کہ سب کچھ کیا جا رہا ہے اس نام پہ کہ مجھے سدھارا جا رہا ہے، لیکن آپ دیکھتے ہیں کہ اس میں سدھار کوئی نہیں آتا، نہ اسکول میں آتا ہے نہ جیل میں آتا ہے. سو ایسی جگہ پہ بچوں کو کیوں آنا چاہیے شوق سے؟ ابھی جو بچی ہم سن رہے تھے جو کہہ رہی تھی کہ میں اسکول کیوں آتی ہوں، اس نے یہ نہیں کہا کہ یہ بہت اچھا پڑھاتے ہیں، انہوں نے کہا کہ یہ مجھ سے پیار کرتے ہیں. سارے بچے کو یہی اسکول میں چاہیے. پہلے 5-10 سال اس کو زندگی سکھانے کے سال ہیں نا جی. سو آپ سے جو گزارش ہے جی ان دو سیشن 2 دنوں میں جو سیشنز ہیں ان چیزوں کو کائنڈلی آئیڈینٹیفائی کرنے کی کوشش کریے جس کو ہم کہتے ہیں کہ وی نیڈ ٹو ریویمپ. ہم نے آج تک ریفارمز کے نام پہ نا پیچ ورک کیا ہے. اس صفحے کو اس صفحے سے تبدیل کر دیں, اس کورس کو اس کورس سے تبدیل کر دیں, میڈیم کو انگلش سے اردو کر دیں, پھر اگلے دن خیال آتا ہے نہیں اردو سے دوبارہ انگلش کر دیجئے, پھر تیسرے دن آتا ہے امتحان 9ویں اور 10ویں کا علیحدہ لے لیں, پھر اگلے دن آتا ہے نہیں یہ تو غلط ہو گیا اکٹھا لے لیا کریں. ہم نے زندگی انہی چیزوں کو ان کو ہم نے ریفارمز کا نام دے رکھا ہے. یہ ریفارمز نہیں ہیں جی, ریفارمز آپ کو فلسافیکل لیول پہ چاہیے, سوچ کے اندر ریفارم چاہیے, اور پھر اس کے ساتھ بہت عرصے تک صبر کے ساتھ چلتے رہنا چاہیے. آپ کو کوئی ریفارم ایسا نہیں ہوتا جو آج آپ کریں گے اور پرسوں آپ کو وہ اخبار کی خبر کی صورت میں کوئی جادو دکھا دے گا. اٹ ٹیکس ٹائم. گورنمنٹس آر امپیشنٹ. دے آر امپیشنٹ ان دا سینس کہ ان کو یہ لگتا ہے کہ اگر ہر روز صبح تعلیم کے بارے میں کوئی بہت انقلابی بات وہ نہیں چھپے گی تو شاید ان کی کارکردگی اس سے متاثر ہو جاتی ہے. ان کی حد تک چلو سمجھ آتا ہے یار, ہم تو اپنے فیلڈ کے لوگ ہیں, ہمیں تو سمجھ آنا چاہیے نا کہ میریکلز ایسے نہیں ہوتے, آپ کو لانگ ٹرم میں سوچنا ہوتا ہے. سو اس پہ تھوڑا سا ہمیں سوچنا کہ نیکسٹ جنریشن کی تعلیم کیسی ہوگی. اور جیسے ابھی ہمیش نے کہا نا, فوکس آپ کی طرف آتا ہے. اب دنیا اس ریجن کی طرف موو کرتی ہے جی. سو بائی ورچو آف یور جغرافیکل لوکیشن وی ہیپن ٹو بی ان دیٹ ایریا سم ہاؤ. ہم ان لوگوں کے ساتھ اپنے ساتھ والے ملکوں کے ساتھ مل کے چلیں یا مل کے نہ چلیں, آپ ان کا حصہ ہیں. آپ کے پاس اپرچونٹی ہے کہ جب وہ اوپر جائیں گے تو آپ بھی نیسسریلی اوپر جائیں گے. آپ نے ان کے ساتھ برابر اوپر جانا ہے, اس کے لیے آپ کو کوشش کرنی ہے. سو اور یہ آپ کے تھرو ہوگا. اسکولز اس کے اتنے پہلو ہیں جی, نصاب ہے, آپریشنل تھنگز ہیں جس میں اسکول کا ماحول ہے اور یہ ساری چیزیں آ جاتی ہیں. اسی طرح سے ایکویٹی ہے تعلیم کے اندر. سب کا جیسا آپ کہہ رہے ہیں سب کا بنیادی حق ہے یار. اس بنیاد پہ ڈسکریمنیٹ کرنا کسی کو کہ اس کے پاس کچھ ریسورسز ہیں یا نہیں ہیں, اس کی پہنچ ہے یا نہیں ہے, علاوہ اس کی کیپیبلٹیز کے, اس کے کمپیٹنسیز کے, پوٹینشیل کے کوئی اور چیز نہیں ہے جس کی بنیاد پہ آپ لوگوں میں ڈفرینشیٹ کر سکیں کہ ان کو اپنی تعلیم میں کس چیز کو آگے پڑھنا ہے. تعلیم سے نکالنے کا تو عمل آپ کبھی بھی اس کو کسی بھی صورت میں ہم نہیں پروموٹ کر سکتے, کوئی بھی نہیں کر سکتا. بنیادی حق ہے جی لوگوں کا. سو اس کی انکلوژن پہ ہمیں بات کرنی چاہیے جی. اور 2-3 بڑے اچھے فکرے میں نے نوٹ کیے کیونکہ آج کے کانٹیکسٹ کی گفتگو میں نا ہمیشہ, اور جب ڈاکٹر صاحب جیسا صاحب بات کر رہے تھے تو 2-3 بڑے غور طلب باتیں انہوں نے اپنی گفتگو میں بڑے سادہ سے انداز میں کہیں جی. تعلیم تجربات اور مشاہدات کا نام ہے. ٹھیک ہے, تعلیم جو ہے وہ آپ کو آپ کی لمیٹیشن سے آزاد کرنے کا نام ہے, جتنا بھی کر سکے. آپ دیکھیے کہ اس میں سے کوئی چیز ہے جو ہمارا تعلیم کا نظام کرتا ہو یا ہم اس کا انتظام کر رہے ہوں کہ اگلی جنریشنز کے ساتھ ایسا. اب جو دور ہے نا جی, چینج کا دور ہے. اب آپ ایک دفعہ جو زندگی میں پڑھ لیں گے وہ زندگی میں اگلے دن کام آئے گا یا نہیں آئے گا یہ آپ کو شور نہیں ہے. ہاں, آپ اصول پڑھ لیں گے تو وہ اس اصول سے آپ جو کچھ بدلتا جائے گا آپ اس کو ساتھ ساتھ سیکھتے چلے جائیں گے. اب چیزوں کو سیکھ لینے سے بات نہیں بنتی, اصولوں کو سیکھنے سے, طریقوں کو سیکھنے سے بات بنتی ہے جی. اس پہ اب غور کریں گے. اور مجھے جو چیز بہت زیادہ تکلیف دیتی ہے نا جی ہمیشہ, وہ جو شعر ہے نا جس کا دوسرا مصرع ہے کہ احساس ضیاع جاتا رہا. ہمیں اب یہ فکر بھی ختم ہو گئی ہے کہ ہم نقصان کس کا اور کیا کر رہے ہیں. ہم اپنے بہت چھوٹے سے فائدے کے لیے, وقت گزاری کے لیے اتنی بڑی بڑی باتوں کو کمپرومائز کر لیتے ہیں جس سے پوری زندگی کا راستہ بدل جاتا ہے. سو یہ جو سب سے تکلیف دہ عمل ہے میرے نزدیک نا, یہ احساس ضیاع کا جانا ہے جی. اس کو کائنڈلی ریوائیو کریے. آپ لوگ کر سکتے ہیں جی, آپ اساتذہ جتنے ہیں یہ آپ کے ذریعے سے ہونا ہے, اور سب سے پہلے اپنے اوپر لاگو کرنا پڑتا ہے. ٹھیک ہے, جیسا صاحب کی گفتگو ذرا بھی معنی نہ رکھتی اگر یہ جو کچھ کیا ہے یہ کیے بغیر یہاں آتے اور تبلیغ کرتے کہ یہ سب کچھ ہونا چاہیے. نو باڈی ہیو لسن ٹو دیم. ٹھیک ہے, صرف اس لیے لوگ سنتے اور کرتے ہیں. امجد ثاقب صاحب کی گفتگو آپ نے غور سے سنی اور یہاں لگی ہوئی ہے اس لیے کہ انہوں نے پہلے کر کے دکھایا ہے اور پھر گفتگو کی ہے. پہلے کر کے پھر بتایا کہ اب ایسے ہو سکتا ہے, آپ کر سکتے ہیں. آپ, میں ایز اے ٹیچر جب تک خود وہ نہیں کریں گے جو کرنے کو کہنا چاہتے ہیں تو میری بات کوئی نہیں سنتا, نہ اس پہ اثر ہوتا ہے جی. اللہ ہم سب کی مدد فرمائے جی. اینڈ آئی ہوپ یو ول ہیو ویری پروڈکٹیو 2 days ہیئر. کنیکشنز ایک دوسرے سے بنائیے, ایک دوسرے کے تجربات, علم سے فائدہ اٹھائیے جی. اینڈ ول سی یو اگین ان دا فائنل in the closing ceremony of this conference. Or I hope that by that time we all must have at least 2, 3, 4 things to take away from here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We now proceed to the presentation of shields and bouquet to our chief guest and the keynote speaker. For this purpose, I request Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Nasir Mahmood to please come in front of the stage, and the conference secretary and conference coordinator to please join him.